Hi and welcome to Malicious Life B-Sides. I'm Ran Levy. Yeah, I know. We should be airing a regular narrative episode today, as we do every other week. Unfortunately, that episode is still in the works, and so I decided to switch places with next week's planned B-Side episode. This is actually a good thing, because in this episode we'll hear about a new cyber espionage campaign unearthed last week by Cybereason's Nocturnus team named Operation CuckooBees. This operation, as Cybereason's researchers wrote in their report, is unusual in several ways. Firstly, it's been going on from as early as 2019, but because it was so stealthy and sophisticated, it went unnoticed for more than 3 years. Secondly, the attackers abused Windows' CLSF mechanism, short for Common Log File System, a rarely used avenue of attack. And lastly, the operation features an elaborate and highly complex multi-stage infection chain, which also enabled it to remain undetected for such a long time. Nate Nelson spoke about the attack with Asaf Dahan, Senior Director and Threat Research Lead at Nocturnus and a frequent guest of our show. Before I let you listen to the conversation, I'd like to remind you that our live Q&A event will take place on June 13th at 12 p.m. East Coast and 9 a.m. West Coast. It will be an online event, and we'll post the link to the event a few days before the event itself. Don't worry, we'll take care of everything. The microphones, the cameras. You just need to do one thing. Ask us interesting questions. That's the whole point of doing an AMA event, you know. What is it that you're dying to know about Malicious Life? I especially love talking to listeners from far away and exotic places around the world, just so I can tell my buddies, did you know that we have listeners in Gary, Indiana? So think about an interesting question, even two, and write it to us on Twitter or by email. My email is ran@ranlevy.com. That's ran@ranlevi.com. And you can even record yourself and send us the recording. Again, June 13th, 12 p.m. East Coast, 9 a.m. West Coast. Malicious Live. And now to Nate Nelson and Asaf Dahan. Enjoy the interview.
What news do you have for us?
First thing first, we managed to find this really outstanding or quite a phenomenal cyber espionage operation. When I say outstanding, I mean that not only just the information that they were trying to steal, but also in the level of the sophistication that we observed, which was pretty state of the art type of operation.
And who is they here?
We attributed the attack to a group called WINTI, or APT41, which is known to be aligned with Chinese state interests, so it's state-sponsored. Also, maybe worth mentioning that this group is not just any group like any other. They're quite advanced. They've been out there since at least 2010. They're one of the most industrious yet elusive Chinese APT groups. They're considered by many people to be like the kings of cyber espionage or intellectual property theft. And the FBI and the DOJ issued arrest warrants and indictments in the past. So in many cases, at least some intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies can actually tie actual people to this group.
And what were they looking for? Was it the usual technology, intellectual property?
We saw that the attackers tried to steal, stuff like blueprints, formulas, manufacturing information. So basically, they targeted different technology and manufacturing company all around the globe. So spanning from Asia, Europe, and North America. And the idea was to obtain, illegally, technology.
I don't think that there's going to be a single person listening to this conversation thinking, hold on, China steals intellectual property from the West. This is something I didn't know before. They've done it. They're doing it. They'll continue to do it. So what, in your view, makes this particular news newsworthy?
We think that this attack, and as well as other attacks that we've been seeing and other vendors have been seeing and other law enforcement agencies reported, are very much aligned with a plan that is called Made in China 2025 that I think it was launched in 2015 or 2016, around that time. And basically, the plan, and according to the Chinese administration, was to become self-reliant, and when it comes to certain areas of technology, so they're able to develop and manufacture a lot of technologies and material on their own, and also to become competitive with the West and other Asian countries. So there are different fields they kind of like put on top of that plan. So like information technology, aerospace, marine engineering, electric power equipment, biopharmaceutical research, agriculture, stuff like that.
So what kind of impact has Made in China 2025 had thus far?
There's a public report that was issued or published by the FBI in 2019 that actually talks about the consequences of the plan. And basically, they're saying that the damage to the American economy, like the financial damage to the American economy, is around, I think, between $200 to $600 billion a year, and which they attribute to Chinese intellectual property theft. And that was back in 2019. And if you're considering that this attack is global and they attacked entities and organizations in Asia and the European Union as well, so we're probably talking about larger numbers. Maybe it's also a good time to discuss WINTI, because I think it's one of the most controversial terms in the world of threat intelligence. It seems like no one seemed to agree about who they actually are, because there have been a lot of when it comes to attribution, there's been a lot of mess around attributing WINTI,
because
we treat it as a big umbrella term, or this big umbrella group. We actually monitor or track 10 different clusters that can fall under that WINTI umbrella. So it's important to understand that it's at this group, it's been active for over a decade now, and it has changed. It has evolved over the years. And what's interesting to say is that I think there have been a couple of reports by Mandiant and other researchers that also noticed that they engage in cybercrime. So imagine that you have hackers working for the state. They do like their 9-to-5 hacking, and then at nighttime they probably want to, get some extra dollars. So they engage in cybercrime.
Right. And if you don't want to speculate anymore, we could just skip this. But is there any way that you square in your head that they do things that seem state-sponsored and then also things that seem cybercriminal in nature?
It's not surprising. Again, like if you consider, let's say, a state employs or uses cyber mercenaries to get for their black ops, or like kind of like dirty jobs, right? So these mercenaries are kind of free agents, so they can use the same techniques and tools that they're using for state-sponsored operations for their own benefit. We've seen the Russians do it. We've seen the Iranians do it. So why not the Chinese?
Fair enough. So let's break down their MO then. How does WINTI first breach a target?
What we saw in this campaign, and also it corresponds to other WINTI attacks, is that they really like, their entry vector or entry point is usually through compromised externally facing or internet facing servers. So in this case, it was an ERP solution that had like a server that was internet facing. We detected scanning, or we saw indication of scanning activity around that, trying to look to see if it was vulnerable or not. And ultimately, they were able to exploit multiple remote command execution vulnerabilities. And that gave him that way in.
All right. So they're in now. What comes next?
The next step was to install a series of web shells on these servers. I think we counted over 20 different web shells. And that gave them their initial foothold, but also the web shell served as a means of running different reconnaissance commands, uploading new tools or additional tools to the environment. So once they installed the web shell, they started running reconnaissance command, basically trying to map out the network, trying to understand who are the interesting users, understand the network topology, see where they can get, where the, let's say, crown jewels might reside in. And it was interesting because they actually invested a lot of time and efforts in their reconnaissance. And we saw them, there's a lot of reconnaissance tools out there, and especially we see a lot of some Chinese threat actors. They bring their own tools, either custom or just like from Chinese hacking forums, the tools that are available on Chinese hacking forum. In this instance, or in this case, most of the tools that were used were simply Windows binaries, so they were living off the land, if you will.
But why do it the hard way if they could just use any of the tools that are out there?
Well, the idea behind it was to not to raise too many red flags, and it seemed like it worked. The next step for them was to dump credentials. So they used several techniques. So some of them are quite known, but we did see them use a custom-built credential dumper, so not the regular Mimikatz or other known tools, which was quite fascinating to see. Once they obtained credentials for high privileged users, they started this lateral movement spree using web shells and different scheduled tasks that they ran. So they methodically started to progress to hop from one server to another, from one machine to another, until ultimately they were able to gain domain admin privileges. Once they got that, pretty much the network was theirs. And unfortunately, due to, let's say, inadequate or poor network segmentation, we actually saw them hopping between different regional networks and different business units, something that you don't really expect when you're doing incident response for large corporations. You think there'd be more segmentation, but at least in the cases that we observed, the hackers were kind of free to roam around from one segment of the network to the other, which ultimately enabled them, that freedom enabled them to get to where they wanted to.
The attack surface has never been larger or more diverse, yet defenders are still forced to piece together intelligence from numerous siloed solutions that produce a flood of alerts in order to detect and end complex malicious operations. No more. Defenders can now leverage AI-driven Cybereason XDR powered by Google Chronicle to predict, understand, and end sophisticated attacks with the only solution on the market that delivers planetary scale protection that allows them to predict attacker behavior through a revolutionary operation-centric detection and response approach. Cybereason and Google Cloud are dedicated to teaming with defenders to end cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more about Cybereason XDR powered by Google Chronicle at cybereason.com/platform/XDR.
And then what do they do now that they're at their destination?
Once they identified the crown jewels, like where the interesting servers, they started dumping a lot of data and moving it to like a staging location where they archived the data. That was like one of the most fascinating steps because we were able to see what they did and what type of files or information they were after. And that gave us that aha moment of understanding the attack. Because I think for every investigator or analyst, there's like, I think the intent is very important. You want to understand who's behind the attack and why are they doing this. And that was this rare moment of clarity. We were actually able to see the type of files they were after. So they looked into sensitive documents, blueprints, diagrams, formulas, and also SOPs. So basically manufacturing related information. So let's say you want to steal, a secret sauce, right? Or like a certain material or a certain technology. So you can, grab the formula, right? But then you also need to know how to manufacture it, right? Like what type of machinery to use and so on. So we saw that they were after all of that information, which was quite fascinating and quite alarming. These companies, they produce all sorts of technologies and all sorts of materials. So one can assume how much data was stolen over that period of time, because as I said, we got to the scene only in 2021.
Okay. I have a few questions about a number of things you said there. Firstly, I've seen a number of sophisticated multi-stage attack chains before, but this one has a particular quality to it. You describe in the paper that you guys published, you described it as a kind of house of cards.
Okay, now you're getting to the interesting part or the more unique aspect of the attack, which talks about the malware infection. So what I described so far was like how the attackers got in, what they did once they were in. But ultimately, the goal, like from a technical perspective, was to be able to deploy and install a very advanced rootkit, really state-of-the-art type of rootkit, which is designed for extra stealth and evasiveness. And we call this rootkit WinKit, which is actually an evolution of an older rootkit that was used by the group. Now, they didn't just like upload a file to the environment and double click and bam, it ran. The deployment or infection chain was quite intricate and complex. So we're talking about like 6 different components that had to work, that are interdependent and had to be executed in a certain order, and they all have to be present in order for the deployment or the installation of WinKit to succeed. So let's say if you take out one of those components, this whole thing falls apart and disintegrates, which makes the installation process very sensitive. Let's say if an AV, for instance, or something happens and one of the files or components is compromised or detected, it would jeopardize the attacker's ability to install that rootkit. But on the other hand, it also makes it very, very stealthy and evasive because each component on its own doesn't look very malicious. Or even if you try to analyze it, you might suspect, okay, maybe there's something a bit off or suspicious, but you can't really understand the full picture. You have to have all 6 components and you have to analyze them in a certain order to make sense out of it. And to the best of my knowledge, we were the first to kind of like get all of 6 components and observe them together and analyze their dependency. And that's how we were able to kind of like reconstruct the attack, the full aspect of the attack, and also get to the WinKit deployment part.
And there's one other notable stealth technique you guys outline. Could you tell me about the CLFS abuse?
As a technique, an attack technique, is something that is quite rare. And again, to the best of my knowledge or memory, they're the first one that abused that mechanism. I mean, the Winty group. So the CLFS mechanism is basically a logging framework. It's like built in Windows. And the way that the group abused it is basically they use this logging mechanism to stash their payloads in a place that most people / security products would not even think of looking. Again, it shows something it tells us a very interesting story about the resourcefulness and how much effort they put into it, the attackers, I mean, because the CLFS mechanism is not really documented by Microsoft, as far as I remember. So they had to reverse engineer the file format and the protocol in order to, make something, just first of all, to understand it, and B, to exploit it or to abuse it.
So you finally cracked the case, but then it's a while before you publish a report about it.
Well, as I said, we got to the CNET. We were called to the CNET 2021. Before that, we were not deployed there, but we were able to gather a lot of forensic data that pretty much allowed us to reconstruct the attack. And also, we had a bit of cat and mouse game with them, because once we found them, we attempted to remediation. They resisted it. We kicked them out. They came back. So there was a bit of a chess game or cat and mouse game with the attackers. So that they're really a resilient and persistent type of attacker.
That's very interesting, because I would have imagined that once they knew that you guys were hot on their tails, they would have run away. But you're saying they kept at it. Why is that? Is it because they had taken steps to make sure that you couldn't find out who they were? Ultimately, it seems like you guys did, or just because they didn't care that you knew what they were doing and who they were?
So that's a very interesting question. Sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive, because when you think about nation state operations, you'd think that once you're burned, you don't go back immediately to the scene and hit it again. However, based on, it happened in this operation, and it happened in other cases, and even specifically with Chinese threat actors. We've seen it in SoftCell and Dead Ringer, if you remember, that they came back 4 times. And there's something a bit counterintuitive about it. As I said, like, you'd think that they would just stop and regroup and maybe try to attack it in a year time, or in a longer, having this longer hiatus. But no, here they were, after a couple of weeks, they were back again. And I think it was like a calculated risk. I think getting the information was more important for them than getting exposed. So that was like the result of their risk management.
What, Asaf, is the most important thing that we should take away from this story?
What we saw here is that, there were some components of the attack that were quite advanced and sophisticated, but what ultimately enabled the attackers to roam around freely in the network and to do, as they wish for as long as they have, had to do with poor IT hygiene. We saw that, we were able to kind of trace back the root cause of a lot of the actions that they were able to take to unpatched systems. So a lot of the system were out of date or simply unpatched. We saw that there was insufficient network segmentation, a lot of unmanaged assets, forgotten accounts, or simply multi-factor authentication. MFA was not enabled on privileged or highly privileged accounts. And it sounds very basic, and you say, oh, of course, that's like, but from our experience, or sometimes not even, especially big companies that you think that have this robust IT procedures and protocols, they tend to be quite vulnerable to the basics. And of course, it's hard to judge because patch management and just like managing, in general, managing huge environments, huge networks of hundreds of thousands of endpoints is not an easy thing to do. And of course, the bigger you are, it's more likely that some server or some server will be forgotten, or some rogue account, or like there'll be like all of those things that are harder to manage. But the point is, it only takes one, unpatched system for the attackers to get in.
CK music.